The red dress was the first thing Caleb Hayes truly saw, and it was the color of a mistake. It stood out against the dun-colored dust of his Wyoming yard, a slash of crimson silk that had no place under the vast, unforgiving sky. The woman wearing it was small, her black hair pulled back so tightly it made her face seem like a porcelain mask, her eyes fixed on the splintered wood of his porch. She held a single, dark wooden trunk by a leather handle, and she did not move. Caleb had sent the letter and the money to a man in San Francisco 3 months ago, after burying his mother and realizing the silence in the house was only matched by the emptiness in the pantry. He ran a ranch with 8 hands, 160 acres of hard-won grazing land, and a profound inability to cook anything that did not end up either burned to charcoal or stubbornly raw. The letter had been plain. He was a widower, 34 years of age, owner of the Rocking H Ranch. He needed a wife. A partner, practical and hardy. He had imagined someone sturdy, weathered by farm work, with hands that knew their way around a skillet and a garden. He had not imagined this. She looked as fragile as a teacup, and the red dress, though plain in its cut, was finer than anything his mother had owned in her entire life. It was the kind of dress a woman wore to a party in Cheyenne, not to a life of dirt, cattle, and endless labor. His foreman, Jed, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the corral fence. That her, boss? Jed didn't bother to hide the disbelief in his voice. Caleb nodded, his throat tight. That's her. He walked down the porch steps, his boots kicking up little puffs of alkaline dust. The woman's name, the letter had said, was Lynn. Just Lynn. She did not look up as he approached, but he saw her knuckles whiten on the handle of her trunk. "Welcome to the Rocking H," he said. The words felt clumsy and loud in the quiet air. "I'm Caleb Hayes." She gave a short, stiff bow, her eyes still downcast. She said nothing. Her silence was another thing he hadn't planned on. He had expected questions, or at least a greeting. He was left standing there, feeling like a fool in his own yard. "Well," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the house. "Let's get you settled." He reached for her trunk, and for the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were dark and unreadable, but there was no fear in them. There was a stillness, a watchfulness that was unsettling. She released the handle, and the weight of the trunk surprised him. It was heavy, solid. He led the way into the house his parents had built, the house that now felt hollow and smelled of stale bacon grease and his own failures. He showed her to the small room off the kitchen that had been his mother's. It was spare, with a simple iron bedstead and a washstand. The red dress seemed to absorb all the light in the dim space. She placed her hands together and bowed again. Still no words. Caleb backed out, closing the door softly behind him. He stood in the kitchen, a place of torment for him, and stared at his blackened cast-iron pans. He had made a terrible mistake. He had sent for a partner to help save his ranch, but it seemed he had inherited a silent, decorative doll who would likely starve along with the rest of them. And he was a man of his word. He was bound to this mistake, whatever it cost him. What he didn't know was that the cost of his judgment was far higher than the price of her passage. The days that followed settled into a pattern of quiet misery. Lynn kept to herself, moving through the house with a ghost-like tread. She cleaned with a meticulous, silent efficiency, sweeping the floors until the pine board shone and wiping away months of accumulated dust from every surface. The house began to look like a home again, but it did not feel like one. It felt like a museum, and she its silent curator. She never entered the kitchen when Caleb was there. She would wait until he had finished producing his morning meal of leathery biscuits and bitter coffee before slipping in to clean up his mess. She ate little, small bowls of rice she cooked for herself on the back of the stove, seasoning it with dried herbs from a small pouch she had carried in her trunk. The men watched her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. They saw what Caleb saw, a woman entirely unsuited for the life she had been brought into. The breaking point arrived on a blistering Tuesday in late July. Jed found Caleb by the corral, trying to patch a fence post with more frustration than skill. "Caleb," the foreman began, his voice low. "We got a problem." Caleb drove a nail home with a sharp blow of his hammer. "We got a lot of problems, Jed." "Which one is it this time?" "It's the food," Jed said, stepping closer. "The men ain't complaining to be mean, but they're running on empty. A man can't rope and brand all day on burnt flapjacks. And, well, the Crawfords sent a rider over this morning. Their north pasture is drying up. They're moving 100 head over to the Blackwater Creek and they're asking if we can spare some hands to help with the drive tomorrow. They said they'd return the favor come our roundup." Caleb put down the hammer, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Helping a neighbor was not optional, it was the law of the land, the only thing that kept small ranches like his from being swallowed whole. But it meant feeding the Crawford men as well as his own. A dozen extra men, all of them doing hard labor, all of them expecting to be fed. That's good," Caleb managed to say, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Tell them we'll be ready." Jed nodded, but his eyes were full of concern. "What are we gonna feed them, boss?" "We're almost out of salted pork, and you know what'll happen if you try to roast a chicken." Caleb did know. The last time, he had produced something that was both charred on the outside and bleeding on the inside. He leaned against the fence post, the summer sun beating down on him, and felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled his knees. He was failing. He was failing his men, his neighbors, and the memory of his parents. As if summoned by his thoughts, the kitchen door creaked open. Lynn stepped out onto the porch, holding a bucket for the well. She wore the same plain red dress, a stark impossibly clean banner of color against the weary brown of the ranch. She must have heard them. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders. She walked past them toward the well, her steps measured and deliberate. She did not look at them. Caleb watched her go, a fresh wave of bitterness washing over him. She was another mouth to feed, another soul he was responsible for, and she offered nothing. He had needed a partner, and he had gotten a porcelain doll. That evening, the mood in the bunkhouse was grim. Caleb sat on his porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, dreading the morning. He had no plan. He supposed he could slaughter a steer, but the thought of trying to cook for 20 men was enough to make him sick. He was so lost in his own bleak thoughts that he didn't notice the kitchen door opening again. It was Lynn. She stood there for a moment, her silhouette framed by the lamplight from within. Then, she turned and walked back inside, closing the door with a quiet click. A few minutes later, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound began, followed by the clatter of pans. Caleb frowned. She was probably just making her rice. He went to bed hours later, the weight of the coming day pressing down on him. But as he drifted into a restless sleep, he became aware of a new smell wafting from the kitchen. It was not the familiar scent of scorched flour or burning fat. It was warm and rich, a complex aroma of herbs and roasting meat and something sweet, like baking apples. He must be dreaming. The next morning, he woke before dawn, his stomach churning with anxiety. He pulled on his boots and walked toward the main house, preparing his apologies to Jed and the men. But as he got closer, the smell hit him again, stronger this time, real and undeniable. It was the smell of a feast. He pushed open the kitchen door. The room was warm and filled with a golden light from the lamps. And it was full of food. On the long plank table, cooled and covered with clean flour sacks, were 3 golden brown roasted chickens. A massive iron pot of stew simmered on the stove, sending up fragrant steam that smelled of beef, onions, and wild thyme. A stack of what looked like scones, tall and flaky, sat on a baking sheet, and next to them were 2 perfect, deep-dish apple pies, their crusts latticed and sprinkled with sugar. And in the center of it all stood Lynn. She was wearing a simple apron over her red dress, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek. Her face was calm, her movements economical and precise as she sliced thick slabs of bread from a freshly baked loaf. She had been up all night. Caleb stood in the doorway, utterly speechless. He could only stare. The kitchen, his place of personal failure, had been transformed into a sanctuary of warmth and abundance. Lynn looked up and saw him standing there. Her expression did not change, but she stopped slicing the bread. The silence stretched between them, thick with the aroma of her labor. Jed and the other hands, drawn by the incredible smells, began to gather behind him, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Jed pushed past Caleb and walked to the table. He picked up a scone, broke it in half, and stared at the fluffy, layered inside. "Well, he breathed." Lynn simply picked up her knife and went back to slicing the bread. She had not said a word, but her actions had spoken with the force of a thunderclap. She had seen the problem, and while the men had talked and worried, she had solved it. The meal was a triumph. The Crawford men arrived, tired and hungry, and their eyes widened at the spread laid out on the trestle tables in the yard. They ate until they couldn't move, their praise loud and effusive. "Hayes," Tom Crawford said, clapping Caleb on the back, "I didn't know you had it in you." Caleb just shook his head. "It wasn't me," he said, his gaze drifting toward the house, where Lynn was already back in the kitchen, quietly beginning the monumental task of cleaning up. "It was my wife." The men looked from Caleb to the house and back again, a new understanding dawning in their eyes. They had all misjudged her. But no one had misjudged her more profoundly than Caleb himself. That night, after the last of the dishes had been washed and put away, Caleb felt a deep, pressing need to speak to her, to thank her, to apologize. He knocked softly on her bedroom door, but there was no answer. He pushed it open a crack. The room was empty, the bed neatly made. A quick search of the house found nothing. A prickle of unease went through him. He stepped outside into the cool night air. He found her in the pantry. A single lantern cast a warm glow over the small, windowless room. She was not sleeping. She had a small slate in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other, and she was making a list, her characters small and neat. She was taking inventory. Cans of peaches, sacks of flour, jars of preserves. She was planning. Her single wooden trunk was open at her feet. Most of its contents were practical, folded clothes and supplies. But sitting on top was a small book, its leather cover worn smooth with handling. The title was stamped in faded gold leaf, and in the lantern light, Caleb could just make it out. It was in English. Mrs. Collins's Table Receipts, a book of American cookery. It was not a Bible. It was a cookbook. And it was the key to a past he knew nothing about, a past that had just saved his ranch. He backed away without a word, his mind reeling. The woman he had married was a stranger, but he was beginning to realize she was a stranger he desperately needed to know. The next day, a fragile truce existed in the house. The air was thick with unspoken things. Caleb watched Lynn as she moved about her work, her quiet competence a constant, humbling reproach to his own assumptions. He knew he had to talk to her, to bridge the chasm of silence that he himself had dug. He found her by the creek behind the house, washing laundry in a large wooden tub. The sleeves of her red dress were rolled up to her elbows, revealing slender, strong forearms. The harsh lye soap and coarse fabric seemed at odds with the delicate silk she wore. He stood a few feet away, feeling as awkward as a boy. "Lynn," he started. His voice sounded rough. She didn't stop her rhythmic scrubbing, but he knew she was listening. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "For yesterday. You saved us a great deal of trouble. An embarrassment." She paused, bringing out a heavy canvas shirt. She looked at him, her dark eyes clear and direct. "It is my duty," she said. Her voice was soft, her English precise, with only a trace of an accent. It was the most he had ever heard her say. "No," Caleb said, shaking his head. "It was more than that. I was wrong about you. When you arrived, I thought." He trailed off, ashamed. "I misjudged you." She turned from the washtub to face him fully. "You thought I was a pretty doll in a foolish dress," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered without bitterness. "This dress was a gift from my last employer in San Francisco. Her husband was a railroad man. It is the only fine thing I have ever owned. I wore it because it was a sign of respect." The simple honesty of her words struck him like a physical blow. He had seen weakness and frivolity where she had intended dignity and respect. "Who taught you to cook like that?" he asked quietly. "That's not the kind of food I would have expected." The railroad man's wife, Lynn, answered. "Mrs. Davenport. She was from Boston. She did not like the food in California. She taught me to cook her way. The food of her home." She gestured toward the house. "That book you saw. It was hers. A gift, when I left." A picture began to form in Caleb's mind, a young Lynn, alone in a strange city, learning a foreign cuisine not for pleasure, but for survival. Her skill was not a hobby, it was a shield, a tool honed through necessity. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, the question that had been burning in him. "You did not ask," she said simply. "You looked at my dress and my face, and you decided who I was. Words would not have changed your mind. Actions are better." He had no answer to that, because she was right. He had been a fool, blinded by his own narrow expectations. "Well," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your actions, they speak very plainly. And I am grateful." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the gurgle of the creek and the sigh of the wind in the cottonwoods. For the first time, it did not feel like a void, but like a space where something new could grow. The moment was shattered by the sound of an approaching buggy. It was too polished, its wheels too fine for a local rancher. Caleb's posture stiffened. He knew that buggy. It belonged to Mr. Sterling, an agent for the Wyoming Land and Cattle Consortium. Sterling was a patient vulture, a man who circled struggling ranches, waiting for them to fail so he could sweep in and buy the land for pennies on the dollar. He had visited twice since Caleb's mother had died, his polite inquiries barely masking his predatory intent. Sterling pulled his horse to a halt in the yard and stepped down, dusting off his tailored coat. He was a man who looked profoundly out of place in the dust, and he knew it. He cultivated it. His smile was all teeth. "Hayes," he called out, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Just passing through, thought I'd see how you were faring." His eyes swept the yard, taking in the signs of activity, the repaired fence, the general tidiness. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then his gaze landed on Lynn, who had gone still by the creek. His eyes lingered on her, a flicker of something unpleasant in their depths. "I see you've acquired some help," Sterling said, walking toward them. "Quite the exotic addition to the household. Must make things interesting." Caleb felt a cold rage settle in his gut. He moved to stand slightly in front of Lynn, a protective gesture that was as unconscious as breathing. "This is my wife, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice level and hard. Sterling's eyebrows shot up in faint surprise. "My apologies, Mrs. Hayes," he said, tipping his hat to her. The gesture was an insult. A man in your position, Hayes, a grieving son trying to hold on to his legacy, one can understand the need for companionship. But this is a hard business. It requires focus. Perhaps you'd be willing to reconsider my company's offer. A fair price, a clean break. You could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere easier. The threat was clear. Sterling was using Lynn's presence as a weapon, implying that Caleb was not a serious rancher, that he was distracted, weak. He was trying to isolate him, to make him seem like an outsider in his own community. For a moment, the old Caleb, the one full of doubt and despair, was tempted to let the insult slide, to be placating. But then he looked over his shoulder at Lynn. Her face was a calm mask, but he saw the tension in her hands, still clutching the wet laundry. She had faced down his judgment and his ignorance with quiet strength. She had fed his men and saved his pride. She had shown him what honor looked like. He would not fail her now. He turned back to Sterling, and the coldness in his gut sharpened into a fine, dangerous point. "The only thing I'm reconsidering, Sterling, is the price," Caleb said, his voice dropping low. "My wife is the reason this ranch is healthier than it has been in a year. She is the heart of this place. And because of her, this land is not for sale at any price you can afford. Now, I believe you were just passing through. I suggest you keep going." Sterling's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He saw he had miscalculated, had pushed too far. He had expected weakness and found a wall of iron. Without another word, he turned on his heel, climbed back into his buggy, and cracked the whip over his horse's back, leaving a cloud of angry dust in his wake. Caleb stood his ground until the buggy was a small speck on the horizon. He had made a powerful enemy. He had publicly drawn a line in the sand, not just for his land, but for his wife. He felt the financial risk of it, the social danger. But as he turned back to Lynn, he saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. The careful, watchful distance was gone. In its place was a warmth, a deep and steady light of respect that felt more valuable than all the land in Wyoming. He had made a choice that could cost him everything, but for the first time since his mother died, he felt like he had something truly worth fighting for. 6 months later, the world outside was a canvas of white and gray. A blizzard had descended upon the territory, burying the fences and howling around the eaves of the ranch house. But inside, the house was an island of warmth and golden light. The air was rich with the scent of baking bread and simmering beef broth. The rocking H was a different place. The pantry and root cellar were filled to bursting, a testament to a summer and autumn of hard work and intelligent planning. Lynn had not only cooked, she had organized. She had established a vast garden that produced a stunning yield of vegetables. She had directed the salting and smoking of meats, the canning of fruits, the drying of herbs. The ranch was no longer living hand-to-mouth, it was secure, prepared, a fortress against the harshness of the Wyoming winter. The ranch hands were loyal to their bones. They were well-fed, and their respect for Caleb had solidified into a fierce allegiance, but their reverence was reserved for Lynn. They called her Mrs. Hayes, their voices imbued with a respect that bordered on awe. The reputation of the Rocking H had spread. Travelers and drovers adjusted their routes to pass by, knowing they could count on a hot, savory meal that was the talk of the territory. This stream of visitors brought not only extra income from the sale of supplies, but news, friendships, and a network of allies that stretched across the county. Mr. Sterling had not been seen again. His veiled threats and attempts to undermine Caleb in the community had amounted to nothing. A ranch that was so obviously thriving, so clearly well-managed, was a poor target for predators. Men who had eaten at Lynn's table were not inclined to listen to whispers against the Hayes family. Goodwill, Caleb had learned, was a currency more powerful than Sterling's money. In the kitchen, Caleb stood at the long table, his large, calloused hands clumsy in a mountain of bread dough. Flour dusted his shirt and his beard. Across from him, Lynn watched, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. She no longer wore the red silk dress. It was folded carefully in her trunk, a relic of a former life. Now she wore a practical dress of blue wool, with an apron tied snugly around her waist. "No," she said, her voice gentle. "Not like that. You are fighting it. You must persuade it." She came around the table and stood beside him. She placed her small, warm hands over his, guiding their movement in the dough. "Fold it. Push. Turn. It is a rhythm. A conversation." Under her touch, he felt the tension leave his shoulders. He followed her lead, and slowly, the sticky, resistant lump began to transform into a smooth, elastic ball. They worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the howl of the wind outside. He looked at her, her face serene in the lamplight, a dusting of flour on her cheekbone. He remembered the silent, fragile-seeming woman who had stepped out of the wagon in a crimson dress, a woman he had pitied and resented. He had been so wrong, so blind. He had thought he needed a pair of hands to do the work. He had not understood that what his home, and his heart, had truly needed was a center. A quiet, unshakable core of strength and wisdom. She had not changed him. She had simply shown him a better version of himself, a man capable of admitting his faults, of defending his own, of building a life instead of just enduring one. She had fed his men, and in doing so, she had nourished the soul of his ranch. She had taken the raw ingredients of his broken life, the grief, the land, the loneliness, and, with patience and grace, had baked them into something whole. You are learning, she said, stepping back and surveying his work with a nod of approval. Caleb looked from the smooth dough under his hands to her smiling face. I have a good teacher, he said. And in the warmth of the kitchen, with the blizzard raging harmlessly outside, he knew it to be the truest thing he had ever said. He had sent away for a wife, hoping for a cook. But the woman who stood before him now was his partner in every sense of the word, the unexpected heart of his home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.